that's what happens when you miss one along the way, right? Then we need a quick recap. So we're trying to work out how much the world is supposed to change once Mashiach comes. Some people will tell you radical change. Other people will tell you, relax, nothing major. It's all going to be as we know it. So what we've done is we've based our entire conversation on a teaching of the Rambam. The Rambam seems to be very clear on the fact that the world as we know it continues. There's no real distinction between now and the time of Mashiach, except for the removal of anti-Semitism or persecution of the Jews, which I think everybody will really welcome. And other than that, everything else that is described is all allegorical. Wolf and lamb. The wolf is not a wolf. The lamb is not a lamb. The lamb refers to the Jewish people. The wolf is allegorical of all of our enemies, and they're all going to dwell in peace, and that's exactly what it means. The only issue that we had is, if this is true, and we have to assume it's true, right? The Rambam is a pretty solid authority. What about other places that seem to indicate otherwise? And we've used as our springboard for this conversation two sources. One is the Midrash Toras Kohanim, and the other is the Gemura and Ksubas. And they both seem to say that there are significant miraculous events to be expected when Mashiach comes. Specifically, they talk about the idea that once Mashiach comes, even those trees that previously were unable to bear fruit will begin to produce fruit. Now, I don't know about you, but to me that sounds pretty otherworldly. Does not sound very natural. So how do we reconcile the Rambam's view, which is, don't worry, no radical changes, with these suggestions that there are going to be great miracles in the world? So we thought we could explain it and say, yes, well, in exactly the same way as the Rambam says that the wolf and the lamb is allegorical, the trees are also allegorical. It actually refers to Torah scholars, and we know that there's a Gemara that tells us that if there is a person who is a renowned scholar, then you should eat his fruit. In other words, you should learn from him. If a person doesn't have such a great reputation, shouldn't learn from them. And so the infertile tree is supposed to represent perhaps the person who is not knowledgeable or not learned. And when Mashiach comes, everybody's going to be learned. It's all allegorical. We thought that might be an explanation. We rejected that. We said it's not possible because both the Midrash and the Gemara are in context. You can't just pluck out one particular reference. You have to look at the context. And the direct context of the conversation in both sources is talking about some very literal changes that will happen to the world. So there's no reason to suggest that this is suddenly allegorical. And then we took another approach. We said, okay, perhaps the issue over here is that there's a difference between how life will be in the land of Israel and how life will be in the rest of the world. So in Israel, there will be supernatural occurrences. And in the rest of the world, life as we know it, life goes on, just minus the persecution. And that we thought might be a plausible explanation, except for the fact that we don't really see anything like that in the language of either the Rambam or the other sources. Nobody seems to make that distinction. You might nitpick a little bit over here and say that the pasuk says, "Vishbati chaya ra'a min haaretz," that Hashem is going to remove dangerous animals from the land. Okay, so perhaps that's it. And perhaps you might find a couple of other references that also indicate the trees producing fruit only in Israel. But we were dissatisfied. We didn't feel that was a clear answer, and it certainly does not appear that the Rambam makes any distinction between Israel and the rest of the world. So we're back to square one. How does the Rambam argue no major change in the Messianic age when there are other sources that speak about clearly supernatural perspectives? So then we introduced the view of what's called the Avodas HaKodesh, one of the classic works. And the Avodas HaKodesh says, actually, it's not miraculous. We're just going back to how the world was always intended to be. We don't realize we've become so used to the aberration that we actually think it's normal. It's kind of like living with COVID, you know? So people start to think that this is normal, that you don't interact socially and that people wear masks, and especially when you look at little kids who've grown up with a large portion of their lives now under the COVID situation. So you forget that this is not normal. That there's actually a real normal. So the Avodas HaKodesh says we forget that the way Hashem originally created the world in the Garden of Eden was without all of these restrictions, and all trees produced fruit, and there wasn't such a thing as a dangerous animal. So it's not like Hashem's going to innovate something brand new in the world. He's just going to take us back to how the world was originally intended to be. So that's where we're up to in our conversation. Now we have to see whether or not we accept what it is that the Avodas HaKodesh says. However, before we can do that, we're just going to examine the wording of Torah's Kohanim and the Gemura, because up until this point, we've spoken about them relatively generically, as if they're both saying the identical thing. They're not. There is a nuanced difference between how they both present the same story. And so based on that, we might have a little bit of an expanded or developed perspective first, and then we'll see whether or not the argument of the Avodas HaKodesh works. So let's take a look inside. Right there at the bottom left-hand side, the part that's highlighted is where we're up to. So, now that we've made this argument that there is this natural sense of trees having produced fruit right from the start, one opinion versus the other possible opinion, which is that it's completely miraculous, and that's how we would satisfy, right? The Rambam would be with the opinion that it's always been this way, and perhaps some of the other sources would say that it is a new miracle. So based on that, we can have a look at the following. So let's say that the nuanced difference between the Midrash and the Gemura talks to what is already discussed and debated in a Midrash right at the beginning of Bereshis. So just to explain what that is, just to remind you, the Torah's Kohanim used the expression that in the future trees will all produce fruit, and the Gemara used the expression that in the time of Mashiach, trees will carry fruit. So the implication of produce fruit is that it's going to be natural. It's going to be a natural thing. Every single tree will produce fruit. Whereas according to the Gemara, it will be unnatural, be supernatural. It will be like a normal tree that almost has fruits dangled on it. So that we need to clarify this point. And in order to clarify this point, we have to look at this question, the debate in the Midrash, right at the beginning of time. Is it true? Because we made a suggestion. We said that it was originally, in the time of Gan Eden, it was the case that every single tree produced fruit. Well, is that true? Not surprisingly, it's a matter of opinion. So we're going to see that there are two opinions. We're going to argue that the Torah's Kohanim, who is of the view that in the time of Mashiach, it will become natural again for trees to produce fruit. The Torah's Kohanim obviously coincides with the view of Rav Pinchas in that original Midrash. What does Rav Pinchas say? So over there, the Midrash, it says this. If you go back to the beginning of the creation of the world, and we're told the first time that trees were created. So the pasuk says, "Eitz oise pri," that every tree, that's how he interprets it. Every tree will produce fruit. Now, how does he get that? We do know that there are different words that you could use in Hebrew to represent trees. Hebrew generally is a very definite language. Everything has a very specific title associated with it. We don't use generic terms in Hebrew. So, for example, you could use the word Elon. It's not so common. It's not so common in the language of the Torah. However, the more common version, eitz, could also be translated as wood. So there's not automatically an understanding that the word eitz means a tree, certainly not a fruit-bearing tree. So when the Torah tells us eitz, oise, pri, if it's telling us that a wood, that's how you could read it, produces fruit, from that Rav Pinchas says that right from the beginning, the Torah wanted us to know that every kind of tree produced fruit. And so that would fit with the Torah's Kohanim that says when Mashiach comes, we're going to go back to the default setting. And the default setting is that every single tree on earth produces fruit. If you go with that view, so then the Torah's Kohanim would effectively be arguing that to have every tree produce fruit is not supernatural. It's going back to the default setting. And that would, of course, fit very nicely with the Rambam, because the Rambam says the world's not going to change. And yet, there is the possibility of a whole lot of new fruits that we have never experienced before. Not because they've never existed before, it's because we have never experienced them before. And therefore, the opinion of the Avodas HaKodesh would be very simply that what's going to happen in the time of Mashiach is the old nature of the world will revive. This would fit perfectly in context. So if you had to go back to the original Midrash Toras Kohanim and read the conversation and how we got to this point, so what does it say? It comments on a pasuk ve'etz hasode yiten period. Now listen carefully to the language. It's commenting on the verse that says, if you listen to what Hashem says, then Hashem will bless you. This is Parshas Bechul Koisai. So Hashem will bless you if you listen to what He says. And how will He bless you? Ve'etz hasode yiten period. That the trees of the fields will produce fruit. Look what the Midrash says. Loi kederech shehi oisa achshav. In the time of Mashiach, it's not going to be as it is now. Ela kederech she'asasa b'mei adam harishayin. Instead, trees in the time of Mashiach will perform as they did already before in the time of Adam Harishon. What does that mean? Eitz peri oise peri leminoi. The first thing is that each tree will obviously produce its particular fruit. But look what the Midrash says: Melamed sheboy bayoim shehu natua boy bayoim oise ferois. The same day that you plant a tree is the same day that it produces fruit. So the Midrash is arguing that that's how it used to be. We do know very well that one of the classic curses that was placed on Adam and Chava after the age from the tree of knowledge is how difficult it will be to produce. You will perspire in the pursuit of making bread. That means that before that, it wasn't difficult. Why wasn't it difficult? Because you planted whatever it was you were going to plant, and it was edible that same day. So the Midrash here argues that that is the nature of how the world was always meant to be, and it's going to happen again. Following from that, we can say that the same kind of principle will apply. In fact, the Midrash says, not only will there be fruit on every single tree, but the eitz asid liyos nechol. You'll be able to eat the bark as well. So life's going to be pretty different when Mashiach comes, according to the Midrash, and yet not different from how it was originally, only different from what we know. So the Toras Kohanim aligns with Rav Pinchas in the Midrash Rabbah, and we can argue that this is the opinion of the Rambam. It's not a change, it's not supernatural, it's the world as it was always intended to be. What are you so surprised about? Whereas the on the opposite extreme, Hagemara Sivura Kedea Shebetchilas Abriya Ilone Asarak Loi Nasu Peiros. Whereas the Gemara and Ksubas would argue that that's not true. There was never a time that every single tree produced fruit. There were always infertile trees. And therefore, Nimtza Kizeh Sheliasid Lavaim Yusu Peiros Hushinoi Hamahave Chidesh. Therefore, the Gemara would be of the view that once Mashiach comes and there are now fruits on every single tree, that's like, wow, that's brand new. That's something that's never happened in history before. And that's why the Gemara uses the expression that it's as if they're carrying the fruit, because it appears to us to be totally unexpected and unnatural. Okay, so what have we got so far? We have the Rambam, who argues that no major changes at the time of Mashiach. It's life as we know it, minus the persecution. We want to know, so Rambam, what are you going to do with all these other fantastic promises about the time of Mashiach? Oh no, those are allegorical. What about the trees? Well, we thought they're allegorical. We said they can't be. We thought it only applies in Israel. We said that can't be. So now we're going with the thinking which says that the Rambam would concur with Avodas HaKodesh, apparently supported by the Midrash Toras Kohanim and Rav Pinchas in the Midrash Rabbah, that what? That all trees used to produce fruit, and if it happens again, it will not be a surprise. It will not be supernatural. Okay, so at this point, we should be able to close the book and say, thank you very much. We now know what the Rambam believes. We have settled all the issues. Don't get nervous. It's all fine. The Rambam believes nothing supernatural will happen. And if anything supernatural does happen, it's really not supernatural because it already happened before. But it isn't as simple as that, as much as we would love it to be. Omnom, kasher medayakim heitev loy niten lefaresh kein. As beautiful as this explanation sounded, it has its flaws. Key. The first reason we say it has a flaw is Aleph, Hapirish anal b'Toras Kohanim. Shebe'ilonei sarak yitachen v'achen yev sharus l'shina liyasid mishum shekach haya b'tchilas habriya einoi chalak. This argument that the Toras Kohanim believes that it is quite feasible in the future to have all trees produce fruit. Why? Because that's how it used to be. Not so glatt, not so smooth, not so simple. Why? Shekain binyonim hakoidmin bepasuk, achein nemar b'Toras Kohanim befeirosh kederech she'asa sabi mei adam harishon. You know why it's not so simple? Because as we just illustrated in the previous paragraph, when it spoke about the idea of plants growing to full maturity in a single day, there the Midrash Toras Kohanim specifically said, as used to be the case in the time of Adam Harishon. And the Midrash was able to prove that point by explaining to us verses in the Torah that date back to the time of Adam HaRishon that said trees grow in a day, or the entire tree was edible. Yet, when the same Midrash now talks about the fact that in the future there will be fruit on every tree, it doesn't say like it was at the time of Adam HaRishon. Yet, and the only proof that the Midrash has for the fact that in the future every tree will have fruit is not from a verse from the beginning of the Torah, but from a verse of promises in Parshas Bechukosai of what will happen in the future. See, this is what happens. It happens to us a lot. We have to be so careful of it. People like to connect dots, and it's a good thing to do, and it's a completely acceptable means of studying. So you make inferences, right? You say, here we were taught X, and maybe I can infer to over there that X applies over there too. It's logical. The only problem with this is you've got to be so careful, and like I say, this is a mistake I think that people often make. We learn by inference. But when we're dealing with Torah sources, they don't leave things to inference. They don't leave things to chance. This is a Midrash we're talking about. It's not some contemporary essay from some contemporary yeshiva student. This is the Midrash. The Midrash makes its words as clear as can possibly be conveyed. So, if the Midrash wants us to believe that something is a reintroduction of how things were in the time of Adam HaRishon, it will say so. And how do we know it will say so? Because it does. Because when it talks about trees going from zero to maturity in a day, it says, like in the days of Adam, number one. And number two, it brings a pasuk from that period of the Chumash to prove it. Yet, here the inference is glaring in its absence. Because here it's telling us there will be, future tense, a time when fruits appear on all trees. It is linked to a pasuk Ve'eta sode yitain, future tense. In the future, there will be fruit. No inference to a precedent. And the Midrash itself does not say as it happened in the time of Adam. So our whole argument was that the Rambam could accept this possibility if it is the reintroduction of old nature. But we don't have proof of that. We have an inference that on closer examination fails under the scrutiny. It actually doesn't seem to be saying what we would have liked it to have said. That's our first question. Number two, Hafilu im nefaresh, she'hanema kederech she'asa b'mei adam harishon, musav gam al ilonei sarak. So you know what you're going to say? You're going to say, yes, of course. But the Midrash already made its point. Why would it have to repeat the same point? It already told us that trees will grow to full maturity in a day, as it did in the time of Adam. It doesn't have to tell us again. The very next conversation is, and all trees will produce fruit. So I can make the inference. And we would then want to argue, as we did originally, that this Toras Kohanim concurs with the opinion of Rav Pinchas in the Midrash, but that originally all trees had fruit. Still ein hadavar chalak legamrei. That's also not so straightforward. Why not? Lefi Rav Pinchas mitzad habriya atzma behesem letzivay HaKadosh Baruch Hu hayu tzrichim liyos ilonei sarach. You've got to follow this step by step quite carefully. Rav Pinchas in the Midrash Rabbah was of the view that Hashem originally created the world to have some trees that bear fruit and most that don't. Now listen to what he says. This is what the Midrash says. You've got to go back and look in the original Midrash. This is what he says. Rav Pinchas's view is that the land, the earth, chose to behave beyond what Hashem had asked it to do. So in other words, he sees it that Hashem instructed the earth that there should be trees. And then that the various nutrients in the earth should allow the possibility that certain trees can produce fruits and others not. And the earth decided to go, so to speak, beyond the letter of the law and empower all trees to produce fruit. And Hashem let it ride until Adam and Chava ate from the tree of knowledge. And then Hashem said, no more. We're going back to my original plan. My original plan is fruit trees and non-fruit trees. So if you do go with the opinion of Rav Pinchas in the Midrash, that opinion stymies our argument. We're trying to say that for fruits to grow on all trees is a revertal to nature. But it's not. Because the Midrash Toras Kohanim does not say that's how it was in the time of Adam Harishon. And Rav Pinchas, the only other opinion on the matter who concurs, says it was unnatural at the beginning of creation for trees to produce fruit, at least all trees. And even if we want to satisfy ourselves that we can somehow conclude that the Midrash Toras Kohanim still believes that there's a way that in the future when Mashiach comes, fruit on all trees will be natural, it's still not going to work for the Rambam. And that's really who we are examining here. We want to know, how do we reconcile the Rambam's view that the world is normal with all the other views of miraculous events in the time of Mashiach? So let's see how it fits with the Rambam. Just to clarify, before we read it inside, the argument so far, which we're already seeing is weaker than we thought, but the argument was that if I can prove that it was always natural for all trees to produce fruit, that would mean that if in the time of Mashiach all trees produce fruit, it is still natural. There's been a hiatus and now it's over, and we're going back to nature. So again, what are we looking for? We're looking to prove that once upon a time, there was a precedent for this reality. Now let's see if the Rambam talks language that is anything like that. Gimel. It's going to be immensely difficult to try and squeeze that logic into the words of the Rambam. Why? The Rambam didn't say that when Mashiach comes, there will be nothing new in the world. If that's what he said, the Midrash could have said, you're right, it's not new, it's happened before. The Rambam said something more radical than that. The Rambam did not want to reject the possibility of something that's never happened before. Listen to the words of the Rambam. Ela shoyl af bitul davar miminhagoi shel oilam. The Rambam's words were far more dramatic. In the time of Mashiach, nothing of the ordinary conduct of the world will cease. Now you ask this question. The world's been around for 5,781 years. Out of the 5,781 years, there was Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and probably Shabbos, 5 days where potentially all trees produced fruit. So which one is min hagoi shel olam? Which one is the ordinary functioning of the world? An unusual experience of 5 days, or the way the world has continued for 5,781 and a half years? It's a no-brainer, right? So if the Rambam had said that at the time of Mashiach, nothing new will happen in the world, okay, fine. Then the Torah's Kohanim could be explained, and we could say the Rambam follows the Torah's Kohanim. It's not brand new. It happened already for 5 days previously in history. But the Rambam didn't say that. And the Rambam's choices of words are so precise. Maybe in a certain way even more precise than the Midrash, because the Rambam is teaching us halacha. And when it comes to Jewish law, you have to be absolutely clear about what you're saying. And yes, of course, this is an area of law that is about the time of Mashiach, but it's no less the language of halacha. It's got to be precise. And he chose not to say that in the time of Mashiach, it's just that there won't be new things, but he dafka chose to say nothing of the functioning of the world will change. Ki im oilam ke min hagoi noiheg. He specifically said the world in its normal way will continue. It is not the normal way of our world for every tree to produce fruit. So if the Rambam insists that at the time of Mashiach nothing will change from the world as we know it, then upashut shehoinyonim vashinuyim anal einam min hagoi shel olam. Then the Rambam cannot accept the possibility that in the time of Mashiach this will happen. There'll suddenly be fruit everywhere, because every one of us will turn around and say, we've never seen this before. We don't have it on record. It's never happened in the history of the world. So that is shinoi min hagoi shel olam. That means we're back to square one. That means we still don't know how to reconcile the Rambam's argument that the world continues in the fashion that we're familiar with, and yet there are so many places that speak about miraculous events when Mashiach comes. How's the Rambam going to navigate that? Ki pirosh min hagoi shel olam hu, the real explanation or interpretation of min hagoi shel olam, the functioning of the world, means kefi she'olam noig bikfius. It means how the world consistently behaves. It doesn't matter to us when this became normal. Doesn't matter. Now it is normal. Whether this normal started on day 1 of creation or day 7 of creation, doesn't make a difference to us. As soon as it became normal and part of nature, ask any person who is into the history of nature, they'll tell you that trees don't all produce fruits and certain animals are dangerous. And if thousands of years have now passed where this is how it is, that there are all of those trees without fruits and all of those animals that attack, shel olam. That is the definition of exactly what the Rambam says will continue in the time of Mashiach. Min hagoi shel olam. The conduct of nature. Ve'im yachul ba'anagosim shinoi ha'hafuch me'anagosim zoi nechshav hadavar lebitul davar miminhag shel olam. And if this is going to change, if those aggressive creatures are now suddenly going to become docile, or all of those trees are suddenly going to produce fruit, every human on the planet will turn around and say, the world has changed. And the Rambam says the world will not change. One second, there we go. Question.
Are we talking about edible fruit or general fruit? Because every tree does produce fruit. It has to, otherwise it can't procreate.
Yes, you're 100% right, and that's the emphasis over here of the word in Hebrew, the word of pri, even though you could say pri from the word peru ruvu, right, which is to propagate, and that's an essential to every living thing in order to be able to continue the species. Yet it is self-understood that when we use the word pri in this context, we're talking specifically edible fruit. So, right, interesting. Very interesting point, and I'm glad you raised it. It's a very important point. Parenthetically, the Rebbe says, now, it would be a real stretch for somebody to say over the last 5,781 years, the nature of trees hasn't really changed. To be a real stretch to say, look, you know that whatever tree you've got in your garden, whatever it might happen to be, that doesn't have fruits, it really does have fruits. It's just that Hashem has decreed that for the past 5,781 years, it can't share those fruits. Or to say that lions are really docile. They're intrinsically docile. Snakes are intrinsically harmless. It's just that for the last 5,781 years, Hashem made them aggressive. He made them toxic. It doesn't make any sense to say that. The only thing that does make sense to say is if they had a particular kind of nature, that nature was altered after the tree of knowledge. That you could argue. But to try and suggest that they are fundamentally the same nature and there's some external force causing them to behave in a particular way is a real stretch. So we are back to the original problem we began this discussion over. The Rambam says not just that there will not be innovative changes to the world when Mashiach comes. The Rambam says more than that. The world as we know it is not going to change, bar for the fact that there'll be no persecution of Jews. How is the Rambam going to explain a multitude of sources that speak about miraculous events in the time of Mashiach? We've only touched on two, that ordinary trees produce fruit and that wild animals no longer are dangerous. There are many others. We're going to look at some of the others as well. So how is this all going to work? Now, just to make things a lot more interesting, does the Rambam really believe that nothing's going to change in the time of Mashiach? We've quoted one source from the Rambam, and he says it in what appears to be no uncertain terms. He says, Lo yivatel davar miminoga shel olam. Nothing's going to change. But let's just understand this a little better. And in order to understand it a little better, we're going to have to delve into a different Gemara where we're going to see that there is a debate on exactly these lines. In fact, it sounds like the Rambam is paraphrasing the one view in that Gemara. And once we start to do that, we're going to run into some problems because basically it works like this. The Rambam is what we call a Rishon, a medieval authority. Now, the Rishonim we take very seriously. The Rambam, Rashi, Tosfos, the Rosh, these kinds of personalities, we take their opinions extremely seriously. Whenever they propose an opinion, an halachic opinion, it has to be founded in a source in the Gemara. What will often happen is, let's just say, I'll use names that we're going to use over here, Rav and Shmuel. Rav and Shmuel are two leaders of the Talmudic community. They lived in different areas, and they very often disagreed on points of Jewish law. So you might then find that, let's say, the Rambam and the Ravid, who very often disagreed on issues of Jewish law, will often align with one of those two opinions. So let's just say that the Rambam follows the view of Shmuel and the Ravid the view of Rav. Now, the thing is this, you can't kind of pick and choose. A Rishon will always be very consistent in their views, much like an opinion in the Gemara will be very consistent. It's what we call the shitase. They develop a particular theme of how they view a series of laws, and then they always comment from the perspective of that particular theme. So it would make no logical sense to say that the Rambam agrees with the opinion of Shmuel in one particular context, and yet disagrees with his opinion in a different context. So it's always important to align the opinion of the medieval commentator, the Rishon, with the theme of the particular Talmudic sage that they seem to align with. Okay, so let's see how that plays out over here. In order to understand what the Rambam really believes about how much the world will or won't change in the time of Mashiach, we need to have a clearer picture of what the Rambam's view is of that entire story. We've just taken out a bite-sized quote. So let's see. Shita Rambam. That's what we want to understand. The shita, the approach, the whole overview of how the Rambam views the development of the Messianic age. So shita Rambam should be Moisa Mashiach Olam Kimin Hagoy Noyeg. At face value, if we assume that the Rambam, as he has said in his own words, believes that the world continues in the functionality that we know today, the reason why the Rambam would take that view must logically be mishum shepoisa kedash Shmuel b'Gemara. It must be because he decides the halacha in line with the opinion of the great sage Shmuel in the Gemara. In fact, he actually quotes Shmuel. He quotes here, the next quotation we're going to have, which the Rambam brings, is a verbatim quote from Shmuel in the Gemara. What is the quote? There is no difference between our world and the time of Mashiach, ela shibud malchios bilvad, except that there will be no persecution of Jews. Whose words are those? Shmuel's words. Who's using them? The Rambam. What do we now know? Sounds like the Rambam must follow the approach of Shmuel. One of the commentators on the Rambam is called the Lechem Mishneh. It's a nice play on words, right? Because the Rambam's book is called Mishneh Torah. Mishneh Torah is like an accessory, as he describes it, to the Torah. So you learn the 5 books of the Chumash, and then you learn the Mishneh Torah, and you know everything practical that a Jew has to do. Now, Lechem Mishneh refers to the 2 challahs that we have on a Shabbos to remind us of the Lechem Mishneh, the double portion of man that the Jews had in the desert, and it's a play on words. Lechem Mishneh is like the second to the Mishneh Torah. You know, it's like kind of the accessory to the accessory. The Lechem Mishneh has a question on this particular point. The Lechem Mishneh says, whoa, hang on a second. Rambam, you have just put your lot in with Shmuel in the Gemara. That means we expect now that whatever else you're going to say about Mashiach anywhere else will also align with other things that Shmuel says in the Gemara. Most notably, the idea that nothing's going to change between now and the time of Mashiach except that there won't be persecution of Jews. Says the Lechem Mishneh, it does not appear that way. It does not seem like the Rambam is consistent in aligning himself with Shmuel. Here's example number 1, Aleph. Big Gemara Nemar, the Gemara says, Ve'omer Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Omer Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Chia bar Abba quoted Rabbi Yochanan, Kol hanevim kulan lo nisnabu ela limoisa Mashiach. All the books of the prophets that are so filled with messianic prophecies, all of those prophecies only describe the period known as Yemois HaMashiach, the days of Mashiach. But the next phase of the development of the world, which is called the world to come, they paraphrase the pasuk that says, no eye has ever glimpsed what it will be like except Hashem for your eye. Or Pli Gadi Shmuel, this particular view of Rabbi Yochanan is at loggerheads with the opinion of Shmuel. Why? The Omar Shmuel, I'm skipping the brackets. It It's just a quote, just a translation. Ein ben olam hazeh lemois HaMashiach ela shibud malchios bilvad. Shmuel says the only difference between now and the time of Mashiach is that there won't be any persecution of the Jews. So, what do you see over here? There are two views. Shmuel says the world as we know it continues without the anti-Semitism. Rabbi Yochanan says, there's a whole lot of prophecies about that time. And those prophecies are so profound that, they describe the entire experience of Yemoi HaMashiach. And then beyond that, there's Olam Haba that we don't even begin to have prophecy about. Now, if there are these two opinions, you expect the Rambam to be consistent. Because the Rambam has already stated very clearly that he agrees with Shmuel that there's no real difference between our world and the time of Mashiach, except for persecution of the Jews, you'd expect that he would say the same thing in this conversation. In other words, he would never make a reference that all of the prophets described prophetic things about the time of Mashiach. I mean, unless they're allegorical. Now have a look what he does. When it comes to this conversation, the Rambam rules in the opinion, according to the opinion of Rabbi Chia bar Abba, quoting Rabbi Yochanan, against Shmuel. Because here the words, again verbatim, that the Rambam uses, Amru Chachamim, our sages said, Kol hanevim kulam lo nibo elin lemois HaMashiach. All of our prophets only prophesied about the time of Mashiach, but the next phase, the world to come, nobody's ever seen it except for you, Hashem. This is inconsistent, and it's completely out of character for the Rambam. The Rambam is so solidly consistent in his views. So what's going on over here? The Rambam quotes Shmuel and decides halachically in his favor that there's no difference between now and the time of Mashiach. And then he quotes Rabbi Chia bar Abba verbatim and rules halachically like him that all the prophecies talk about the time of Mashiach. Which one is it? Sounds highly inconsistent. There's a second example. I'm conscious of time. I don't know if we'll necessarily get to read the second example inside, so we'll pick up, please God, next week on it. But here's the overview of the second example. So there's a very interesting discussion in the Mishnah in Tractate Shabbos about what you may or may not wear in public on Shabbos. So the principle basically says that on Shabbos you're not allowed to carry something either from a Reshus HaYachid, a private domain, into Reshus HaRabim, a public domain, or more than a distance of 4 amos in a public domain. So for us, we take these things for granted, but we shouldn't. We walk outside wearing glasses on Shabbos, right? Is that allowed? Let's assume that there's no Eruv. Are you allowed to walk outside wearing glasses on Shabbos? So it's subject to some halachic exploration. If you have to wear glasses because you have a prescription, in which case you're not likely to take off your glasses at any point because then you can't see, no issue. But what about sunglasses? Where you might meet somebody on the way home from shul, and it's pretty rude to, talk to him. Maybe it's considered the convention that you take off your sunglasses to talk to somebody. Or maybe it gets cloudy halfway home and now you can't see so well. And now you take off the glasses, not even thinking, and you walk. Could be a problem. And there are many other examples like this. For example, there are certain kinds of rings that are suitable for women to wear and others that are suitable for men to wear. And if somebody had to switch and a man would wear an ornamental ring as opposed to, in those days, used to have signet rings, that would be considered carrying on Shabbos. So the Mishnah asks this question. Is a man allowed to walk outside on Shabbos with his sword on a belt, in its sheath? Is he allowed to walk outside with a sword? It's a debate. So one opinion is, Rabbi Eliezer says, in the same way as you could walk wearing fancy clothes, a person with his sword at his side, it is a form of like an accessory, and it's completely acceptable on Shabbos. The Chachamim, the majority of the sages, say, no. The fact that when Mashiach comes, it says they will beat their swords into plowshares tells me that a sword is actually objectionable already now, and you're not allowed to carry it on Shabbos. So we have to then decide which one does the Rambam go with. Because you'd expect the Rambam should agree with Rabbi Eliezer, because the Rambam says no miracles when Mashiach comes. None of us beating their swords into plowshares. So that will be the next example that we examine. And effectively, we're going to walk out of here with two cases where the Rambam appears to be inconsistent in his opinion. After we've done that, we're then going to look at a third scenario where the Rambam seems to say very clearly in his own words that not only will the world change when Mashiach comes, but in the most radical fashion. So we're really going to have some sticky issues to deal with over here. What does the Rambam really believe? How much is our world going to change in the time of Mashiach? Well, we'll pick this up, please God, next week. Not sure if anybody has any questions. Let me just allow the possibility of unmuting. So there you go. So if you'd like to ask a question, more than welcome.
Thanks so much. Have a Mashiach week.
Amen.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you.
Shkoyach, everybody.
Thank you.